Hello and welcome to the Ka0s Tournament Podcast. Today we will be talking about a little bit of a different topic than our normal, although something we've skirted along for a while. We'll be talking about the turbo problem. And for that we'll be talking about what is turbo, how does turbo and mid-range work. Most of our podcasts are relatively on rails as far as here's what we're talking about, here's what we're talking about, here's what we're talking about. This one I expect is going to be a little bit more freeform. I am Fetch. With me today is Kuma.
Yo.
And Neko.
Hey everyone.
But getting into it, we're going to lay out loose definitions for mid-range and turbo. We'll start off with comparing it to a 60 card format and then see how it differs from that ideology when bringing it to 4-player 100 card singleton and how that changes things up. Of the archetypes that we have in CEDH, mid-range is the one that goes most 1-to-1 with 60 card formats. You've got, there's some differences, don't get me wrong, but mid-range is a term that's used in both, and to some extent it has overlap as far as what it means.
So what mid-range refers to in 60 card formats, at least to my understanding, is that you're kind of trying to be halfway in between aggro and control. Now that doesn't mean that your deck is half aggro and half control. What it means is your goal is you are trying to be bigger than the aggro decks, right? The aggro decks are running a lot of 1 and 2 mana, little cheap threats. Your job as mid-range is to weather that storm long enough till you can start landing something bigger and kind of stabilize the game. Versus aggro, you are trying to be the control deck. You are trying to outlast them and go bigger, while at the same time trying to be fast enough that you can still race the control decks before they take over the game. So to the controlled matchup, you are trying to play aggro, right? Mike Flores wrote the famous article, Who's the Beatdown? That is kind of the quintessential question of mid-range. Are you trying to win fast, or are you trying to hold on and stabilize versus the deck that's better equipped to win fast? So mid-range is kind of like trying to be between. Now, does that translate to 100 card formats? It really doesn't. But to me, that's kind of the history of where mid-range comes from.
Right now, if you're familiar with Standard, and I only know a little bit about Standard, but from what I understand, they have their own kind of mid-range problem. Right now, Esper mid-range, and to a lesser extent, Grixis mid-range, which I believe just got some nerfs with bans, are really warping the format. And you have the Esper decks in that format that are playing things like your Rafine, your Shieldred, these kind of more expensive value pieces that you can get down and start doing just really crazy things with. Rafine and draws you so many cards. Shieldred with that can draw you life. Kiki-Jiki Nearbreaker, that was a really powerful card for a while. Yep. And they are a bit more expensive than what you would normally play in your typical aggro strategy, where you want to get more of like the 1-2 drops down pretty early.
When I think of mid-range, I think of, at least for Magic, obviously it varies from formats. Some formats are way faster than this. For Magic, it's like, okay, a mid-range deck is a deck that runs 3 drops and typically up to 5 or 6 drops, depending on what's the powerful card in the format at the time.
Yeah, it's basically accurate.
Yeah, you run your little stuff too. It's not like you're not running any 1 drops, but that doesn't quite go over into CEDH because 3 drops don't really exist in our format.
Yeah, 3 drops are the high end in our format. Well, ish.
Yeah. 3 drops are more common right now, I think, but once you start getting into 4 drops, that's when people are starting to make the cuts. Like, I already have this 1 4-drop creature. I have this Notion Thief. I can't justify something like a Grim Hireling in this deck anymore.
Yeah, 4-drop in CDH needs to take over the game in short order if left alone. Like, it's a pretty high bar to clear.
Yeah.
We don't just run good stats for the cost.
Yeah.
Some do, though. We were talking before this a little bit about Kinnan. Kinnan can cheat them out, but they can also just cast them. And you have some more expensive decks, but they're few and far between right now.
Yeah, so to me, the big difference between that definition and the 100-card formats is that I think the 100-card formats are a little more unipolar or bipolar. I'm not sure what the correct term in here is. Basically, to me, in 100-card formats, you have basically 2 camps of decks. You have the decks that are trying to force through a win as fast as possible, running just enough protection to make that happen, not really worrying about the long games. They don't plan to be there. And then you have the decks that are trying to kind of play a longer game. They're trying to spend their first few turns maybe setting up the long game while the turbo players are trying to find their pieces. And their goal is to just outlast the decks that are trying to burn bright and fast. So to me, there's mid range is not really trying to be faster than aggro but slower than control. There's basically to me at its core there are two archetypes in CEDH: fast and slow. Now, two slow decks might look very different from each other. Two fast decks might look very different from each other. But to me, mid range has kind of come to mean in CEDH a deck that's trying to be, I shouldn't probably say slower, a deck that's trying to go longer, a deck that can win fast in a lot of cases, whose main goal and whose commanders and card choices are set up to kind of play a more longer game and kind of pick your moment after a certain point.
We'll get to that a little bit more shortly, but we should define Turbo a bit. Obviously, Turbo is the fast deck.
Turbo go burr. That's all you need to know. You go as fast as you can. You play all these value pieces to get consistency in your deck. You have rituals. You have, looking at RogSi, you have ways to abuse the commander just to get you as much value as quickly as possible.
Right, RogSi is trying to power up cards that help you win fast with the commanders. It's not trying to play a longer game with its commanders. Its commanders are basically there. Silas is basically there for color identity, and Road is there because he makes about 6 to 12 cards go burr.
Yeah, and you keep saying value. I don't think that is the accurate word for it. I think specifically with Turbo, they don't really care about just playing for value other than maybe as a backup. Value isn't really what your game plan is. Your game plan is to win as fast as possible with whatever way you're doing that.
Yeah, I feel like Turbo at its best is the famous Mike Tyson quote: everybody has a plan going in until they get punched in the face. Like, Turbo's goal is just to punch you in the face as soon as possible. So whatever your plan is never has time to come together. And then the game's over. I've won, too late. Let's shuffle up and I'll do it again.
Yeah, and the best Turbo decks either punch you in the face really fast or punch you in the face a lot of times so that you eventually lose your guard.
Yeah, resiliency is, I think, something a lot of people don't expect with turbo decks. I think there is a kind of notion with things like RogSi where if they get stopped as they try to go for the win, they're dead in the water and they can't recover. But in actuality, a lot of these decks just run such a high card quality that they can recover pretty quickly, especially if they have something like a Rhystic Study on field.
Well, I think Rhystic Study is not a turbo card. It is not
good. A turbo card.
But what I think Turbo has the thing where there's such card density, like threat density, where you are just putting so much forward as far as, okay, are you going to stop this win? No, I win. Oh, yes? Okay, what about the win that I put forward next turn? And the turn after that? And eventually they run out of juice. Like, you aren't running all of these crazy value pieces where you can just go off forever. Although, I mean, sometimes you get that lucky. Sometimes you just draw well.
I mean, that's how my favorite kind of Hermit Druid decks are built. Oh, you killed my Hermit Druid, here's Shallow Grave. Oh, you countered that, here's Postmortem Lunge. Oh, you countered that, I'm just going to Thassa's Oracle Consult now. Like, to me, that's kind of where I like to be in Turbo, is just I'm going to try to win every other turn until I can't anymore.
Honestly, if we're talking about, okay, Turbo or deck that win fast, go all in on the win, and then try to do it over and over again, there's a whole lot of quote-unquote mid-range decks that fall into that category. So what is the difference?
I think the difference for mid-range is that Turbo wants to go fast, mid-range wants to win where it can. Mid-range is designed to sit back and get what value it can and wait for its window to go off. Turbo still likes to wait for its window too. You don't always want to jam it with Turbo, but the ideology is you want to kind of make them have it sometimes. Mid-range, you are like, okay, I have the Thassa's Oracle turn 2, let's try to do this. Or a player just tried to win, this could be a good window. Interaction's probably pretty low right now. You have stacks decks that want to slow the game down until you get the combo assembled, or you can win through beats. Mid-range is that go between. You're just waiting for your chance, in my opinion.
Yeah, my metaphor for this is Turbo is the deck that's running around opening windows, trying to force the window open, sticking a dowel rod in there so it can't close. Stacks is the guy running around trying to slam the window shut. And mid-range is the guy who's sitting back and waiting for one of them to get tired so that he can go through the window.
That's a good way of putting it.
Yeah.
But as we're talking about, okay, stacks versus mid range, what's the or not stacks? Stacks is a whole nother animal. Turbo versus mid range, what's the difference? What decks are turbo? What decks are mid range? What decks are arguably both? Which that's a weird conversation that we'll get into in a bit.
I mean, it's a spectrum. You can be in a place on the spectrum where it's not exactly clear what you are.
Yeah.
And that's the human nature, right? Humans like to put things into categories. They try to put them into boxes and justify where they can put them in those boxes. So that's why you kind of see these archetypes in CDH, and there are decks that just don't fit in cleanly in any of them.
One, talking about in 60 card, you have the idea of a tempo deck. And it's like, what the hell does that even mean? Tempo is just like, oh, I play my good stuff, and then sometimes I go fast and sometimes I don't. And for CEDH, every deck is a tempo deck.
I was going to say, ask 10 different Magic players what a tempo deck is. You'll get 12 different answers. Like, nobody can agree on what a tempo deck. I think it maps best onto Turbo based on my own understanding of it. But there's really not a tempo deck in 100 card. People called Najeela tempo for a while, and it sort of did that. But really, you can't tempo so easily when you have 3 opponents. You kind of need... Tempo's more of a something you can take advantage of in a 1v1 context easier than you can in a 4-player context. I think for purposes of this conversation, in a 100 card, tempo is basically turbo. You're just trying to get your win in there and keep your opponent on the back foot before they can recover and put your win in. To me, that's turbo more than anything else.
Yeah, that's why it's like every deck is a tempo deck, because every deck you're trying to play the timing and slam down your big threats when you can.
Tempo's a whole other conversation. There have been countless words written on what is tempo by Magic players better than any of us. Yeah. And that might be an interesting topic to talk about someday, but I think that's a little in the weeds here.
No, that's why it's like, yeah, tempo is weird. Tempo is, I don't want to say nonsense, because there is actually, tempo does mean something. It's just what it means is so nebulous. And a lot of CEDH falls under that.
Yeah. But CDH is not without its kind of similar situations, right? How many definitions of there for mid-range are there right now? You see people try to define it in different ways. And I made an analogy before, and these two didn't get it, but maybe our audience will. If anyone knows One Piece, you have your Logia Devil Fruits, you have your Zoan Devil Fruits, and you have the Paramecia, which is just anything that's left out. And I feel like that's what people try to make mid-range right now.
Mm-hmm.
If you're not turbo, if you're not stacks, you must be mid-range. Yeah, I definitely see a lot of that, which is weird because I think mid-range outnumbers both of those. If anything, if you're not mid-range, then we should fight about if you're turbo or stacks. But I guess there's not a lot of overlap there. If you're clearly on one side of that spectrum, there's not a lot of overlap between turbo and stacks. Maybe something like Zero Game Actions, Tivit is almost turbo stacks, but nah.
Since the defining, okay, what exactly is turbo, what exactly is mid-range, is such a hard thing to do. We're going to go through deck by deck for some of the more notable decks in our formats and talk about, okay, where does this fall on the spectrum? We'll start on more of the extremes and then make our way in where it starts to get a little bit blurry. So, first things first, we've got RogSi.
Oh, this is a stacks deck, clearly.
Obviously.
Yeah, we can all agree on RogSi. That's definitely a turbo deck.
Yeah, RogSi, pretty much the archetypical turbo Nas.
Yeah, you're sacrificing something like Tymna to go faster with Rogue Rack by powering up a bunch of cards like Culling the Weak. That's definitely turbo. Or something like Cody, I would say, if anyone even still plays that, is definitely turbo. You're trying to power up Cody and slam the win in before somebody ruins your day.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, Rog and Silas don't really do a whole lot if you get stopped. It's just kind of Rog enables a ton of fast mana and then a handful of other cards that do other things. And then Silas gives you blue and black. And then very occasionally you play him for a small amount of value.
I remember a long time ago there was some cuteness people did. They'd run like Ether Spellbomb and then try to have Silas bring back Ether Spellbomb to draw you cards to build back up in the mid game. But I'm pretty sure that's not something that happens in that list anymore.
Not so much,
Though
no.
I do want to highlight just how important Rog is and why it is such a strong card, because it's that idea, right? You want to go fast. RogSi is a 0 mana commander that you can get down turn 1 with no other investment. And like you were saying, Fetch, it turns on so much for you. Even if it just turns on your interaction, you have things like your fierces, deflecting swats that you can use, and that just really helps you go fast.
It really does. But going on to, I don't want to say the other end of the spectrum, because that makes us feel like we're going to a super slow deck.
There aren't super slow decks in this format.
No, not if you want to play a good deck.
Yeah.
Win Countless Stacks might argue, but here we are.
I stand by what I
wouldn't
said.
call that a good deck, but
Fair enough.
But yeah, going to Tivit, which I would list as one of the strongest mid-range decks in our format right now.
absolutely, at least as far as tournaments are concerned, this one just keeps putting up results, and it's pretty easy to see why. Your commander is a great source of mana and cards that help you play a longer game. It's also a kill condition. You kind of get both in one. Blue Farm has to run 2 commanders to do some of that. You get to do it all in one. You definitely run cards like Counterbalance, right? Counterbalance is not a turbo card. Counterbalance is this is going to sit on the table for 5 or 6 turns and give me insane value. Something like Turbo doesn't want to run Counterbalance. So, well, I don't want to sit around and collect value. I want to run just enough interaction to force it through as fast as I can. And Counterbalance basically makes me take a turn off to maybe do something in the future. No, thank you.
But Fetch, I'm hearing from our imaginary comments, Ad Nause's is run in Tivit. How can it not be a turbo deck? I'm glad you asked.
Me too.
So, even though Ad Nause's is run in this deck, I would say there's one big thing that differs this from Turbo, at least specifically Turbo Nas. There are other Turbo decks outside of Black, they do exist. It's just Turbo Nas is the most common Turbo strategy.
Yeah, I mean, you can Turbo without Ad Nauseam, but I would say the vast majority of Turbo decks are going to be on some kind of Ad Nauseam plan. Not just be on Ad Nauseam, they're going to run cards that make Ad Nauseam good. It's not just a random 5-mana draw spell to a turbo deck. It's this is my everything.
Yeah. Tivit is a deck that uses Ad Nause to draw cards, not necessarily win the game. It's not all in on the Ad Nause plan.
Yeah, so my rule for this is kind of as such. If you're running Ad Nause and your goal is to main phase it as soon as you can and have an extremely high probability of winning thereafter, to me that makes you a turbo deck. If you're the kind of deck where you might be okay with, I'm going to throw this off at the end of their turn to kind of reload in the mid game, and maybe I'll untap and win. Maybe I drew the exact right cards to main phase it, but I'm also pretty happy if I end of turn it and untap with about 12 or 13 cards in hand and just start taking over the game. That to me makes you more of a mid-range deck. And I think Tivit is probably comfortable in that second role, even if it can. I mean, any deck that runs Ad Nause can just instantly win if they main phase it. But decks like RogSi run a bunch more cards to support that than something like Tivit.
Yeah, I talked to Jamaican Dude and interviewed him. If you are watching this right now, that video will be out. You can go check. There will be a link right now that you can click on. But with specifically Tivit, or at least his list, the way that he mulligans is for your value pieces for your card draw. So he looks for, I mean, even like Esper Sentinel. He looks for Esper Sentinel. He looks for Mr. Gamora. He looks for Rhystic Study. Those are his top priorities, along with like any of the other big value pieces.
Yeah, and I think that's really what defines mid-range is you are happiest to see things that draw you extra cards, or things that speed out your commanders that draw you extra cards. That is generally where mid-range is happiest. That is possibly the surest sign of a mid-range deck.
When you Enlighten Tutor, for example, you're not going for the Underworld Breach, you're going for the Rhystic Study.
Absolutely.
kind of that kind of callback. But I think another place you can see this distinction in the Adnos plan is also in the CMC of the list. Yes, we don't run crazy high CMC cards in most black decks. Well, outside things like Reanimator targets or Bolus the Citadel, but for a RogSi list or any turbo list, you kind of want to keep that CMC lower. You have that conversation of what is my CMC before the ad nos, because like you said, Kuma, you're so reliant on it. As opposed to the mid range, you can run higher CMC things because you're not as invested, so you have a bit more wiggle room there.
I mean, I think personally, ad nauseum players tend to be a little bit too obsessed with their deck CMC. I got an ad naus player in my local play group, and he's always like, "Hey, which card should I try out? Which card should I cut?" And I'm like, "Well, how about this one?" He's like, "Oh, but that raises my CMC." And I'm like, "Yeah, you're running a 3-drop instead of a 2-drop. I think you can take the hit." To me, it's like play the best cards, and then if you have a giant problem with CMC, you can talk about going down. But I don't think most decks are anywhere near that problem. And watching people make inferior card choices to kind of keep that CMC down, I think is largely misguided. But I mean, Neko does have a good point. Like, the decks that want to do it on their main phase are going to run a lot more low mana cost cards, because that's what you have to do if you want to instantly win. If you're jamming that Nas as soon as possible, you need to draw as many 0 mana rocks as you can after the fact so that you can actually do something after the fact. A mid-range deck that might want to wait a little longer might be able to Nas at an end step, then untap with all their mana. Or they might have 2-3 extra mana when they cast the Nas, and it's not as important that they hit every Chrome Mox and Mox Diamond in the deck after they do it.
True, but if you compare, like, I'm looking at my list right now, my RogSi list, compared to Jamaican Dude's Tivit list. The average mana is almost identical.
Yeah, that's
his is
really
actually
it.
slightly slower, or slightly lower average mana.
Is Tivit has lower average mana than your RogSi? I'm a little surprised to hear that.
It's by like less than 1%.
Yeah, I mean, we're always talking about like what, maybe 20 to 30 CMC in the entire deck. That's an average of a third of a life point more per card you flip at most. It's probably not even that. It's probably more like 10 to 20. So we're talking about a fraction of a life point per card flip. And then people want to talk about a fraction of a fraction. It's like, okay.
And we play the same variety of cards, right? CDH is not a wild variety format, especially when you play similar colors like Esper and Grixis. I think what you have to look at there too is what kind of cards you're running in there and kind of the trade-off that white gives you as opposed to red. Fetch, last time we recorded, you made the point that Esper might be better than Grixis, and I think as I thought about that more, I came to agree with it for the idea that mid-range is really strong right now, and by choosing white over red, you lose things like Breach, and you lose things like Dockside, which are strong pieces, but you don't really lose much else. When you get white, you get so many high-value pieces right now. Your Esper Sentinel, Grand Abolisher, Silence, Ranger Captain, yeah, those pieces. And you have such a higher quality of white cards than you would with red. So that's part of the thing. Like, when you're turboing, you see a Dockside, you're really happy. But you sacrifice red, you're losing that. And what you're getting instead is probably overall better right now.
Yeah.
Not that being said, mid-range players still love a Dockside. They'll run Phantasmal Image of Postermech to try to get one, but it's just that good of a card.
The only times I think I've been sad to see a Dockside is when I have a Collector Oof and a Stony Silence out, and even then I'm still feeling pretty good. So
the only time I'm sad to see a Dockside is when the Dockside doesn't get me as many treasures as I want, and then it still usually gets me something. So
yeah. Even if you break even on a Dockside, the color fixing and the potential for mana on later turns is just so good.
Yeah, absolutely agree. But we're talking about a lot of these value pieces as your blue, where it's like, okay, yeah, RogSi still runs the Rhystic Study and the Mystic Remora because those cards are just insane. But if you're looking outside of blue, what do you look for when you're talking about a mid-range deck? And I think we're going to be talking about another deck that, while can be more argued as far as where it is on the spectrum between mid-range, turbo, and even to some extent stacks, I'm going to bring up Minsc, specifically Minsc Hulkless.
So Minsc is interesting, right? Because it's a deck that can win fast, but it's also a deck that likes to run those tax pieces because it can play under them so well.
Well, and a lot of the Minsc decks that I have seen perform really well are decks that, while they do run some stacks, they don't run anything crazy. Like most mid-range decks and even some turbo decks run things like Opposition Agent, which obviously this doesn't have access to, and like Draenith Magistrate, just because it's a good card. And Minsc, depending on the variation, Minsc Beloved Ranger doesn't run any of those crazy big stack speeds. You're not a rule of law deck. You're not super reliant on slowing everyone else down. You just kind of do your own thing.
I mean, yeah, that's kind of our definition of a turbo deck. My problem with decks like Minsc is, okay, you're trying to go as fast as you possibly can without black. You're trying to protect yourself without blue. So to me, like the Naya turbo decks, it's just like, what are you doing? Like you're a turbo, you're trying to enter a stock car race with like a Ford Pinto. It's like, yeah, I think you get pretty fast if you go downhill and put the pedal to the metal in third gear or whatever. But you're just to me, a deck like Minsc, yeah, you're trying to go fast, but you're just not fast enough. Oh, I win on like turn 4 X% of the time. Okay, well, RogSi wins on turn 2, what? Like in a goldfish, 40% of the time, something crazy. Like that's what you're fighting with. And what do you have over it? You have a couple of stacks pieces. You have a bunch of Protean Hulk cards that are just bad draws. So I mean, yeah, it's a turbo deck if we're going to classify it, but to me, it's a pretty poor one. It's a turbo deck that's not especially fast. You don't get those oops, I win on turn 2 hands.
For that, I actually disagree with it being turbo, though. I actually think it's more mid-range. We mentioned, again, decks like to run some stacks pieces right now, but those are really only mid-range decks. You don't see too many turbo decks running too many egregious stacks pieces. I guess Notion Thief and RogSi, so maybe this whole thing's falling apart. But regardless, I also think that the deck, like we were saying before, it's waiting for the time where it can get its piece and go
because
off.
It has to. Like this is not a knock on you, Neko, but this whole idea that like Minsc is mid-range is a giant dose of copium. It's the, well, since I can't be as fast as I like, I'm going to just say I'm a mid-range deck. I'm not trying to go fast. Joke's on you. I didn't really try hard. And it's like, no, dude, look at your deck. You have no card advantage in the command zone. You have like what in your deck? Esper Sentinel, Sylvan Library. Are you even running like a Toski or something? It's like you're not a mid-range deck. You're just a really bad turbo deck that's trying to cope by saying I'm mid-range.
If we talk about a card, it's like no card advantage in the command zone. Instead, it is a win condition, a very good one, mind you. I think Kuma is underrating Minsc as a deck. But what about Najeela? Najeela doesn't have any card advantage in the command zone. Yeah, she has access to blue, and that's great. But where does she fall?
Well, first of all, you get to run better colors.
You have 5 colors.
You can have fast Oracle wins.
But Najeela did start out as that mid-range, though, right? You had things like Toski, Grim Hireling, some of those higher mid-range pieces to get that value. And then people decided, no, I like her more as turbo deck, so she shifted. I like to play a lot of Sisay. Sisay has she has no traditional card advantage in the command zone. She's more of the toolboxy outlet, kind of a combo piece. She's more of a mid-range deck. Yes, they're higher colors still.
Yeah, Sisay is definitely mid-range.
But like Minsc and Boo, right, is a combo piece. It's a 1 card, essentially. You get the right piece down, you win.
Not Minsc and Boo. Minsc and Boo is the green-red.
Minsc and Boo is the value piece I run in Joda to draw me about 9 cards in the mid-game to make sure nobody can take it from me.
We're talking about Naya Minsc here.
Naya Minsc, yeah. So, similar names, I got confused there. But the idea is... But, right, like, still the 1 card in the command zone that you have. So you're waiting to get those pieces. And I don't know, maybe I'm just thinking, when I think turbo, I think like these weird lines where you're casting multiple spells, almost like you're pseudo-storming off, and then you're at the end winning, as opposed to Minsc, where you are just playing the 1 card and then you're winning from there. Plus, you also have a 3-mana Pip commander in the command zone, which kind of hurts the idea for me thinking of it as turbo.
Well, and they do run some value pieces, but it's also like we can't just say, oh, it doesn't have blue and therefore it's not a mid-range deck, or it doesn't have black and therefore it's not a turbo deck, because then you look at Minsc and it's like, well, unless you're saying this isn't a deck, which I think if you're underrating Minsc...
Can I say that?
I think if you are underrating Minsc to that degree, you haven't played enough against it, because this is a deck that can so consistently put out turn after turn of win attempts. Like, legitimately, this deck can be terrifying sometimes.
Look, I'm not saying you have to run black to be turbo. I'm just saying if you're not running black, you need a damn good reason. And something like Godo, the reason is I can just make 11 mana with all the red cards that make mana and then win the game with my commander alone. To me, that's an example of a good non-black turbo deck. To me, Minsc just... Its basic game plan is get the Hulk out as fast as possible. It doesn't run a lot of the tools to play a long game. Sure, it has some resiliency because it's a graveyard deck. You can reanimate the thing if they stop it. But to me, it's a deck that wants to go fast and just isn't as fast as some other options you have in the archetype.
Yeah, but Minsc has like 7 one-card combos.
Yeah.
Well, you
so
know
to
how I feel
be the
about
kind
that.
of I think Minsc is a really strong deck. Is it the best deck? No. I would probably put it at a B tier if we're being objective. But it can win. It can be resistant. But when you aren't playing things like blue, depending on what the pod looks like, you will struggle because blue is just such a strong color in the format. I still think Minsc is really good. But I also think Minsc is still mid-range, not because it doesn't have black or blue. We look at Bergie. Bergie I would call a turbo deck, and that's only like a red deck. I think just the playstyle that Minsc likes to go for, I would classify more as mid-range, even if it is just one card combos.
And that's why it gets complicated as far as, okay, what are we talking about as mid-range? What are we talking about as turbo? And we'll get to what will be the most controversial list in just a little bit here. But when you're looking at any deck and being like, oh, this is a turbo deck or this is a mid-range deck, it gets so messy when it comes to stuff like Tymna Tana. Tymna Tana, while there's a lot of stacks variants. There's a whole lot of variants of Tymna Tana. So there's like stacks lists, there's Blood Pod, there's I believe I heard of one of the recent decks that made top 16 for Ka0s was known as Red Farm.
Oh yeah, you can totally turbo Nas in those commanders if you want.
It's like, Tymna Tana, what kind of deck is that? It varies so drastically depending on what the specific build is.
Tymna Tana isn't a deck, it's a commander pair.
Yeah, but like,
I know we like to refer to decks' names as their commanders, but some more like Tymna Tana or Thrasios Tymna is where that kind of breaks down. If I put Thrasios and Tymna on the table, I could be turbo, I could be Razaketh, I could be mid-range. There's a lot of different things I could be.
We've been talking a lot about these categories, right? And we've been saying they aren't neat, but they are still something people like to use. And I think there's a place for that, right?
Yeah,
like when you sit down at a table, exactly, being able to sit down at the table and identify what kind of pod you're playing against, looking around, because that affects things like your mulligans, what kind of wins you're going for. So having the information is helpful, but like you're saying, not all decks fit neatly. You have decks that can fit multiple archetypes. Kenrith, I think, is a really good example of that. Najeela, where we see a shift, things like that. It's not always cookie cutter clean.
Kenrith is something.
I mean, Tymna could be a stacks deck, a mid-range deck, or a turbo deck, and that's what we appreciate about you.
Tymna's the best commander in the format. So.
Easily. Best partner for sure, probably just best commander. I've often said if you played Tymna, the Piper, whatever that thing was from Commander Legends, is probably better than a decent chunk of the database just because Tymna's that good. Tymna plus the Prismatic Piper, whatever third color you want, is already a pretty good deck. I would never register that in a tournament, obviously, because there's clearly better options, but I feel like if your deck's not better than Tymna plus a random third color, you probably shouldn't be playing it, and I think there's a decent number of decks that fail that bar.
Yeah, I mean, Tymna is a really strong commander. I think she lends herself best to more of a mid-range strategy, just based on her ability. You want more creatures, you want to get that card draw, and I think based on the meta we have right now, it's really good. But partner, good colors, there's reasons, so I think that can change, but based on the current climate, Yeah, just the best you can be playing.
So here's how I like to think about it. So as someone who spent a great deal of time in college on both sides of the lecture hall, it's often said about college professors that there are two different kinds of college professors. There are the ones who are like, oh man, I got to teach, and the ones who are like, oh man, I got to do research. Some people are there for their research abilities. Some people are there because they want to impart knowledge. To me, there's two different kinds of turbo-y mid-range decks, like something like Tymna. They're the Tymna decks where it's like they want to turbo and they're like, oh man, well, I guess I have to mid-range sometimes. And there are the Tymna decks where they want to mid-range, but sometimes they just draw the fast win and they're like, oh, I guess I have to turbo. So to me, that's a more important distinction is, what do you want to be doing and what do you kind of accept your ability to do as a compromise? Like, I mean, a turbo deck can sometimes play a mid-range game. A mid-range deck can sometimes play a turbo game, but that's not really what you're designed to do. That's not what you're happiest to do. So to me, that is the important distinction with something like
Tymna's
that.
got the whole spectrum just because of how good it is.
Yes.
Yeah.
But when you talk about Tymna, one of the things that immediately comes to mind is Tymna Ka0s. So, Tymna Ka0s, Blue Farm, is a deck that runs two commanders that have card advantage on them. However, Kuma, I know you are very passionate that this is in fact a turbo deck, not a mid-range deck. So,
yeah,
you have the floor.
Yeah, absolutely. So this plays into what I just said. I was really hoping you would segue into Blue Farm, because to me, Blue Farm is the deck that says, I'm turbo, and oh man, I guess I have to mid-range sometimes. Now, this is not a popular take whatsoever, but the way I look at it is decks that run ad nauseum. We kind of talked about this a little bit before. If your goal with ad nauseum is to cast it on your main phase and then immediately win, that makes you more of a turbo deck. If you're okay with sometimes end of turning it, untapping with the value, and continuing to play the game of Magic, even past that next turn, that makes you more of a mid-range deck. So to me, I look at something like Tymna Ka0s, and I see it running almost all of the exact same cards as a turbo deck, a deck that is clearly turbo, that nobody disagrees is turbo, such as RogSi. And yeah, you're running some things they're not. But I mean, if you look at Blue Farm lists recently, Blue Farm used to run a lot of like little creatures to kind of support the Tymna plan. They really don't anymore. Lists are cutting stuff like Loyal Apprentice, which is probably the ultimate mid-range card, to that list. If I want to look at, we had a 6th place finish in the last tournament here. How many creatures do they run that are basically in there to support the mid-range plan? They run Esper Sentinel, which is a mid-range card, sure. Ragavan, I mean, does RogSi run Ragavan? I'm not 100% on that one.
It varies from list to list.
So sometimes they run that. Okay, Draneth is definitely not a turbo card. I'll give you that. Fairy Mastermind, sure. Lavinia, definitely not. Grand Abolisher is arguable. But like, we've got single-digit cards here that I would say are purely to support a mid-range strategy. So to me, if you're a 90%...
There's only 14 creatures in the list. You can't be like, oh, only single-digit.
Well, a lot of those creatures are cards. Fastest Oracle doesn't count. You're going to run that if you're turbo. Not all of those creatures count. Like Dockside does not count. Yes, it can draw you a Tymna card, but if you weren't running Tymna as your commander, you'd still be playing Dockside. That's not necessarily true for something like Fairy Mastermind.
Okay, but if you're running blue, black, and red, no matter who you are, unless you're running specifically like a polymorph thing, you should be running. I say should be. Some people don't. You should be running Dockside and Ka0s Oracle.
Yes, of course. My point is, though, they don't count as mid-range support cards. They count as cards you'd be running no matter what. The fact that they have a little bit of incidental value on the mid-range is not a mid-range deck make. So to me, like, my point is, if you 90% of your cards are in common with a turbo deck, I think turbo just describes you better than mid-range. Can this deck play a better mid-range game than something like RogSi? Absolutely. I mean, it's definitely farther down the spectrum toward mid-range than something like RogSi, but not far enough down the spectrum that I'm comfortable referring to it as a mid-range deck first and a turbo deck second. When I play Blue Farm, and I will fully admit I'm not the strongest Blue Farm player in the world, I get most of my wins off hands where I just go fast. It's like, if I can turn 2 Ka0s, I'm jamming that every game. I'm winning most of my games. If I'm so happy to turn 2 Ka0s and my deck is fully built to support that, yeah, I mean, yes, I have a mid-range backup plan, but to me, mid-range is the backup plan. Now, certain pods, you may make that your plan A, but I think generally speaking, into most pods, you're happy to just jam it as fast as you can and then possibly pick up the pieces with the Tymna and the Crom and the command zone.
So I think that I disagree. I think Blue Farm is more mid range. I think it's a deck that can turbo. And of course, you're never going to say no to a turn 2 Nas in most circumstances because it's just very strong and you're in really strong colors. But I think it's more of a player mentality. When Blue Farm first was created, I think you saw a lot more of the turbo lists, and some of them do still exist. But if you look at what players are prioritizing in most games, they're more interested in the turn 2 Crom as opposed to the turn 2 Adnaz in most situations. They're going to keep a hand that can keep Crom turn 2 and not complain about it. And you made the point that yes, there aren't those things like Loyal Apprentice, but I think the strength of Blue Farm is that you are running two just value pieces in your command zone. Crom is going to draw you cards. Tymna is going to let you draw cards with Crom. So you don't need to run Loyal Apprentice, which lets you play the higher density. I do think where it kind of gets murky is, though, again, you're playing more value piece commanders. If you look at something like Tymna Jessica or Tymna Dargo, Tymna Rog, those are more turbo decks that can utilize the other partner, right? You can play Dargo, you can play Rog, you can sack them, or use Jessica as an outlet. And then Tymna's there not only for colors, but the mid-range backup plan. I think Bosch and Roll especially is probably the most notable player who we saw the shift with. I alluded to earlier, using the Enlightening Tutor for the Ristic study. So yes, you're playing a lot of the same colors, but I think the mindset on how you play them is different.
So, in my opinion, the reason why Blue Farm is so scary is because you ask the question of, is it turbo or is it mid-range? And the answer is yes.
Mm-hmm.
I personally would still describe Blue Farm as a mid-range deck, but if you have a hand where you can slam a turn 2 Nas, you do it every time. Unless there's some weird stuff going on at the table, or you suspect that, okay, based off of how this person is playing, they have whatever so that it's going to screw me over. You absolutely will take those turn 2, even turn 1 Adnaz hands, but that is not the only thing that you take. If you're playing RogSi, like as someone who plays Turbo primarily, if you are playing RogSi, you basically hard mulligan for either an Adnaz or a wheel 9 times out of 10. If you have like a turn 1 if you have like a turn 1 Ristic study, that's great. You take that. And assuming like sometimes you might give it back, but 9 times out of 10, if you see, okay, I've got turn 1 Ristic study, I have anything else in this hand that makes it worthwhile, I'll hold on to that. But otherwise, I'm pretty much hard looking for either Adnaz or some way to refill my hand using a wheel. That is not the case when it comes to Blue Farm. If you have an Esper Sentinel and a handful of other value pieces or stacks pieces, then you keep that. If you have an Adnaz that you can get early, then you keep that. And it just kind of depends on the table and what you've got in hand.
Mm-hmm. That kind of goes to what I was saying earlier, right? Mid-range is best at looking for the open window, regardless of where it is in the game.
Yeah, and I mean, you can certainly play Blue Farm as a mid range deck, and you can do that with perfect utility, and you can do that quite well. But my thought is more if you want to play mid range so badly, why not play a deck that's a more dedicated mid range deck? Why not play something like Thrasios Bruce, Dawnwaker, or whatever, instead of a deck that runs like 80 cards, not including lands or plus in common with a turbo deck? I mean, you could play it like a turbo deck and just take the free fast wins when they come, and you'll do that perfectly well. And I think that goes back to what Fetch said. Is it a turbo deck or is it a mid range deck? Yes. And what I mean by yes is you can draw a perfectly legit mid range hand, and then everybody else is in trouble because they thought you were on turbo. Or you can draw a perfectly good turbo hand, then everyone else is heuristic studies start looking bad. Blue Farm is probably the strongest deck in the format because in any given game, it can play either role reasonably well. Now, I will not say Blue Farm is better at mid-ranging than a more dedicated mid-range deck. And to me, it just has so many turbo pieces. And I'll tell you what, when I play the deck, and I will admit this could be skill issue because I am not the world's best Blue Farm player, but I win a lot more games off of turn 2 Ka0s than I do off of turn 2 Crom. So why would I aim for the turn 2 Crom when I could aim for the turn 2 Ka0s? Granted, there are more hands that will give you the turn 2 Crom, but I don't know. To me, if I want a mid-range, I'm going to mid-range. I'm not going to, turbo in a mid-range skin suit.
Blue Farm is probably the best deck, like you're saying. And the reason that I think it mid-ranges so well is because once you get an engine online with that deck, you draw so many cards that it becomes impossible to really manage.
Well, I mean, your command
Not
zone
only
is
do you have the
double
two
engines. Like, what other support do you need?
Exactly,
It's like
but if you have a
free
Ristix,
mid-range plan in your command zone, that is not a mid-range deck make.
yeah, but if you're having mid-range in the command zone, then mid-range on the field's pretty good, I guess. You know what I mean? Like, and you get those engines, and you have your Esper Sentinels, you have your Ristic studies to add to that value. So I think I think Blue Farm is being really great at the deck that can win second too. You know what I mean?
Well, yeah,
Yeah, absolutely.
you often do want to win second. Like, if I'm a mid-range player, I'm happiest if I'm not the fastest person to try to win at the table. If I have to be the first one to go off in a mid-range, I'm going to be a little bit nervous because, yeah, my deck's built to recover from that, but is it going to recover from that by the time my opponents are ready to go after I got stopped? And the answer is often it isn't. So mid-range is definitely more comfortable not being the first one to try to win. A turbo deck, I feel like, is more comfortable in that slot. They're trying to force through with enough fast mana, card disadvantage, free counter spells that they can just force it through and hopefully it gets there. Whereas something like mid-range, I think you're better off sitting back a little bit.
But with what you were saying earlier, Kuma, about how you win more off of a turn 2 Adna's hand, but you get more hands that give you a turn 2 Crom, I think that's kind of why Blue Farm is that weird in between. Is because, yeah, obviously, if you have a hand that gives you a turn 2 Adnas, you're happy about that. You're not going to complain. But you also aren't going to complain when you get a hand that says, okay, you get Crom out on 2, and then you get Tymna out on 3. Or vice
Not
versa.
usually, no. I can think of situations where I'd rather just be nosing, but yeah.
Well, but I can think of situations where I'd rather not play the Naz on 2, so...
Yeah, I mean, if you went turn 1 land Mana Vault and your second player turn went land Deafening Silence, yeah, I can understand not jamming the Naz on turn 2. That's about it.
Yeah, but that's like a value, right? It's a weird deck and it can check many boxes, and that's why it's so strong. And I agree with you, Kuma. Like, if you can turbo in that deck, you're in great colors to do it in. You are playing those high quality of cards. So even though you lack some of that utility in the command zone, you can still get really far with that turbo plan with the deck. And you can catch people off guard with that. And if you want to do the turbo strategy with it and then pivot to the mid range after, you'll still get pretty good results in most situations, I think.
Yeah, nobody's disputing that Blue Farm is a wonderful deck. It's just, to me, the mid-range plan it's kind of the lesser of two plans, and it's kind of just something you get to do for free because of your commanders. So is it a deck that can mid-range? Yes. Does that make it a mid-range deck? In the way I think about things, no, it does not.
That's fair.
I think part of that comes down to just it having access to both red and black.
Well, to me, the best turbo color is black, and the best mid-range color is blue, and you get both. So any deck that runs both of those can often do kind of at least an imitation of either strategy. But Blue Farm does more than just imitate. Blue Farm really does it quite well.
And decks that can pivot like that are really powerful. So, well, yeah, blue and black, two good colors in the format. Who would have guessed it?
But with us talking about and kind of coming to blows on Blue Farm, I think comparing it to a deck that has some differences, but a lot of similarities in a very unusual way, would be beneficial for us furthering this, as we're talking about a pretty new commander, one that is still seeing progression with Atraxa, Grand Unifier. I think Atraxa leans on the turbo side of midrange.
Oh, definitely. As to what
It
I would
does.
call it, that's definitely a tough question. You got any better thoughts on that, Neko?
So it's weird colors, right? Because you sacrifice red for a really strong commander. And when you are using an Adnos strategy and you don't have red necessarily, it's weird because you're playing green instead. And green gives you a lot of dorks. And dorks are weird with Adnos because they, in most cases, won't have haste. So some of the fast mana you might get normally is turned off. But you also play a commander that can fill your hand, but that commander's what, 7 mana? So
Yeah.
See,
give
the
and take.
especially weird thing about this is that currently a lot of the top Atraxa decks, we'll see if this changes, but currently a lot of the top Atraxa decks don't run Adnos, which I
Yeah.
personally think is a mistake. I'm just going to say it right now. But it's like, okay, can you still be a mid-range, can you still be a turbo deck without Adnos? I mean, obviously you can. You like we said you can do it outside of black. You can even do it inside of black when you're talking about like Crick. But that's weird, very specific stuff. But a deck that just runs good stuff, can you be turbo if you're not on Adnos?
I mean, if you're fast enough and comfortable trying to win fast, yeah, sure. I think that's kind of what a lot of the old Hermit Druid decks were. Was they were just a bunch of good cards and Hermit Druid. Your goal was to get the Hermit Druid, play the Hermit Druid, reanimate the Hermit Druid until your opponents ran out of interaction. And a very long time ago, that was something that you could do, not so much anymore. So if Blue Farm is on the mid range side of Turbo, I would kind of agree with you. I would say Atraxa is on the Turbo side of mid range. And I think the main reason for that is you have black in the deck. Now, I was going to say this about Blue Farm, but I'll just kind of say it now. To me, Dark Ritual is not a mid range card. That doesn't mean mid range decks can't play it. But to me, Dark Ritual is kind of the antithesis of mid range. It's burn resources now and forget about what comes next. This deck runs Dark Ritual, but if you kind of look through it, that's about the only mana ritual it runs. You're not running like Culling the Weak, at least not in the list I'm looking at.
No.
You're not running as much super fast. You're running something like Wild Growth, and Wild Growth is something you would probably see at least in more of a mid range deck. You're running mana dorks. You don't see a lot of mana dorks in turbo decks because you kind of want your mana right now. It's my mana and I want it now, like to paraphrase all those commercials on daytime TV on CNN. But yeah, so to me, you do have the hallmark of a mid-range deck in that your commander is a value engine or a card advantage engine. You cast Atraxa, you're drawing probably 5 to 7 cards, something like that, probably when you cast it, and you even get some selection on that.
Yeah.
You kind of get the free mid range plan again because if the game stalls out enough, you just drop Atraxa and then you're probably right back in the lead. You're not running that many cards to make it as fast as humanly possible. Like you're more of a food chain deck, and food chain decks tended to be turbo decks, but a little more mid rangey turbo decks. And yeah, I mean, it's really tough to say. I realize I'm kind of contradicting myself here as I kind of work through this in my head. But my gut feeling on this was it was the turbo side of mid range. Actually, having read the list, I wonder if it's not more the mid range side of turbo. I'm still a little bit agnostic on this. The more I look at the list and think about it.
So one of the cards that you brought up was Dark Ritual. And I think that I disagree with you to some extent with Dark Ritual. Yes, obviously, it is the turbo. Like, Dark Ritual is one of the best cards in turbo decks. But also, Dark Ritual is just good. So, if you are a mid range deck that has a commander that costs a lot of mana, but gets you a ton of value, yeah, sure, play Dark Rit.
Yeah, I guess I buy that here. I buy that less in the blue farm is a mid range deck argument.
We've seen in a lot of our tournaments an Atraxa come down and win the game on the same turn. It can do that really well. You can kind of mini Nas, right? It's almost a mini Nas in the command zone with all the other benefits that you gets you. So getting all those cards, yeah, I think you could try to turbo off like that. And if you don't, you get card selection when you go to discard, and you have a big body on the board to deal with life totals. But it gets tricky, right? because we've talked about green and we've also talked about how expensive your commander is. Because you can get Atraxa down probably consistently turn 3, but not anything sooner than that in most circumstances. So could you say a deck like that could be called turbo if it has to wait that long?
When I last talked to Chris, obviously Chris constantly experimenting with his deck, constantly trying out new things. But when I last talked to Chris, his main goal for Mulligan was to get enough mana to go for a turn 2 Atraxa. Or turn 3 on some occasions, but like if he can get turn 2, he does. He doesn't like full Mulligan, toss everything away for that, because you need so many things to be able to do that.
Yeah, that sounds pretty turbo to me.
But that is his main game plan, with his secondary game plan being getting out these value engines.
And we talked about like mulliganing for like the turn 2 commander. We talked about Crom and how that kind of relates to the mid-range strategy, in my opinion. Atraxa, trying to get that down, that does seem more turbo, right? Because it is a turbo piece in your command zone.
Yeah, it's interesting to me you compared Atraxa to Ad Nauseam, because the card I think Atraxa reminds me of the most is actually not legal in the format, and that would be Grizzlebrand. To me, Atraxa is 4-color Grizzlebrand. Now, Grizzlebrand could draw you like 35 cards on the spot, but Atraxa lets you run more than just black out of your command zone and still gets you about 5 to 7, but also 5 to 7 with some selection. And as we've seen, that's often enough now. Back in the very brief window of time you could run Grizzlebrand, it was pretty trivially easy to build a deck that could win when it drew 35 cards, but off of a single Grizzlebrand activation, I don't think we have the card quality in the game yet to make that happen as often. If it were around now, I think you'd see a lot more 7 life into Grizzlebrand instantly win the game. I think the card is, I don't hate that it's banned. I don't want to get into a ban list discussion here. But to me, I think Atraxa is closer to Grizzlebrand than it is to Ad Nauseam. Just something I wanted to interject.
I mean, Legacy would agree with you on that, given the problems they're having with Atraxa.
Oh, Atraxa is good in every format that's legal and even vintage. Like, that card is just a house.
I love that card.
If you play Magic, you should probably own that card.
But looking at it like this, right, you get the consistency that Black offers with the additional card selection. So getting one of those pieces you need is pretty simple, whether that be the food chain or whether it be the Displacer Kitten. At the same time, Fetch, you mentioned that Christopher Claw likes to get Atraxa down turn 2. Is that Atraxa turn 2 with mana still available as the follow-up, or is that all resources into Atraxa?
I mean, as someone who has been goldfishing this deck a whole lot recently, because I'm looking at putting it together, it's really hard to still have mana up after a turn 2 Atraxa.
Yeah, I would say you're not winning on a turn 2 Atraxa at the same turn in the vast majority of cases. It probably takes you a turn or two beyond that, but it puts you in a very strong spot that makes that win a lot easier than if you didn't do it.
Typically, it sets you up for that turn 3 win, and then sometimes you can just get a turn 2 win using other things. But typically, 3 is the average for goldfishing as far as where you win.
Yeah, I guess my point is with turbo decks, so you want to get that initial value as quickly as possible, and then use that to win kind of immediately. As opposed to if you're passing with Atraxa, that almost feels more mid-rangey in that game plan. But again, just a turn difference it can make. Like playing the turn 3 Atraxa, again, we've seen just the value that can still have. So
I mean,
it's quirky, it's weird.
Can I just interject here and say that if you care what your goldfish turn is at all, you're probably a turbo deck. If you know your deck's average goldfish, you are probably a turbo deck. I have no idea what my average goldfish in my stacks decks are. I just don't care. Like, I don't care what turn I win on. I care on what turn I can lock the game out. So, like, that's the goldfish I care about. Like, to me, if you're saying, well, my deck goldfish is on turn 3, the fact you're even thinking about that should probably strongly push you in towards thinking you're playing a turbo deck. I don't hear about mid-range decks talking about goldfishes a lot. They just, I'll win whenever. Turbo's no. I can get it down to 2.5. It's from 3. That's a very turbo mindset.
It could just be because I'm a turbo player, but in my mind, even if you're goldfishing, in my mind, even if you're goldfishing with Tivit, you are looking for, okay, how fast can I win this?
I mean, you probably have some idea, but it's not something, as a Tivit player, you probably spend a lot of mental energy on. Like, I've never sat there with a mid-range deck, played like 40 games, and tried to figure out my average goldfish. I've done that with turbo decks.
Goldfishing is weird outside of turbo anyways.
Well, yeah, exactly. You can't goldfish a stacks deck. All right, I have Imperial Seal in my opening hand. What stacks piece do I need here? Do I get Oof? Do I get Lavinia? It's like, well, what am I playing? Well, I don't know. I'm goldfishing. I'm playing an empty goldfish bowl.
Yeah,
Yeah,
like I've
exactly.
goldfish mid-range decks just trying to see what I can assemble and try to play through lines like that. But you never know. If you like, my goldfish win rate is insane. I'm just gonna say that right now.
Oh yeah, I've never lost to goldfish either. Well, that's not entirely true. I think I have actually screwed up like some sort of pack trigger or something before to a goldfish, but that's neither here nor there.
The only time I have lost goldfish is killing myself off.
I'm sure I cast the Summoner's Pact while goldfishing once, realized I couldn't win that turn, passed to myself, and lost. I'm sure it happened once somewhere. I'm just going to put that out there.
I have at least a 90% win rate as long as I'm playing against no one.
Who needs these 4-player formats anymore? We should just solitaire this.
Yeah.
Yeah, the evolution of Magic, right? It's like that shirt, right, where the ape like slowly stands up into the man, then he hunches back over his phone or whatever. That's kind of what we're talking about here. Magic started off as a 2-player format, and then it evolved into a 4-player format. Now we're down to 1 player hunched over our deck in a goldfish bowl.
You've never experienced Magic till you've played a Commander game with 8 people, and you can't see what someone on the other side of the table is doing. You're just trying to listen, and you're there for hours.
I'll do you one better. You haven't played Commander. You played a 6-player game of Commander with Zer's weirding on the table. Did that once at a truck stop late at night after a legacy tournament. Was there till about 6 in the morning trying to finish that game. It didn't finish. Turns out Zer's weirding slows the game down more than possibly any other Magic card not named Stasis.
I will be happy to say that apparently I've never experienced Magic, and hopefully I never will.
In that case, I agree with you.
Yeah, it's a rite of passage, if anything else.
I don't think we're going to come to a conclusive ending on this, just because of how complicated the idea of turbo versus mid-range is and where everything falls. We could go through hundreds of examples and never agree. Obviously, there's some things that it's definitively this is that. And then there's some things where you could ask 100 different people and they'd have like 20 different answers.
The real mid-range is the friends we made along the way.
I do want to highlight one thing too is, yes, it's complicated, but there is merit in trying to figure it out, right? There's merit to being able to sit down, piece it together, and then also as the game goes on, try to figure out what the person's doing and then making those assumptions then. Regardless of what the commanders are, like we said, different things can do different stuff. You can have, I don't want to say biases, but, preconceived notions of what a deck will do. But when you're not sure, just learning to recognize the different steps.
Well, yeah, and if we didn't like really complicated problems that arguably don't have a solution, we wouldn't be Magic players. Like, that's what Magic is.
Yeah, I'd say if you learn anything from this podcast, other than we have weird takes on decks, learn that when you sit down to a table, try to assess what everyone is aiming to do, and keep updating that in your mind as you play.
Game knowledge is your biggest strength here.
Yeah, Joe says it's half the battle.
But as we come to a close here, we'll be going to our closing segment of Wed Ded Magic Edition. This time, we're going to do things a little bit differently. Not too much. It's not going to be too crazy. But instead of doing like a deck or a specific card, we're going to do our card types in the context of mid-range. So we've got the choices of in mid-range, Wed Ded, fast mana, hate bears, stacks creatures, not just like, Collector Roof, but things like Draneth Magistrate, or even to some extent Opposition Agent. And then for our last option, we've got 1-card win cons. So I'm sorry, Tivit, you're going to be potentially losing your time Thief here.
All right, so I tend to play this the most straight, so I'll go first. So you might think that I would be wedding stacks pieces in mid-range, right? I'm the stacks guy, but honestly, I'm not wedded to that idea. I think some mid-range decks, a couple of stacks pieces is just fine. There are others where it's like, the ones that are more turbo-y, it's kind of like, you don't really need that Draneth Magistrate. You don't really need that, whatever it is, Collector Oof. Like, it might even slow you down in that case. So I think sometimes a stacks piece or 3 is good in a mid-range deck. But call me a stacks purist if you want. But I think I'm going to bed stacks pieces in mid range because that's a sometimes thing. That's not a take it home and show it to your mother thing. So I'm gonna go with that. So as for Wed, what am I going to Wed? To me, a one card win con is a one card win con. Like, why wouldn't
That's
you
a
want
fair
to play a
point.
one card win con? So to me, I don't care what my deck archetype is. If I got one card win cons, I'm probably playing them. Are you going to build the Gila without Derevi? No. Doesn't matter if it's the Gila Stacks, the Gila Turbo, Najila, whatever the hell she is today. You're going to run Derevi, right? You're going to run that one card win con. So I'm definitely going to wed the one card win con. Which, I mean, I guess that means I'm deading the fast mana in mid range. And I think that's pretty consistent with what I said earlier in the episode, right? I said Dark Ritual is not a mid range card. Doesn't mean that a mid range deck can't or shouldn't run it. But to me, the more stuff you run that's like a Lotus Petal or a Dark Ritual, even a Chrome Mox, I mean, mid range is all about accruing advantage. Cards that kind of pull away from that, I don't think really feel right in a mid range deck, even if it is technically correct to run them. So I'm not going to say I never run any of those cards in a mid-range deck, but if I had to dead one thing out of mid-range, I would dead the fast mana and just focus more on trying to build a large advantage over a longer time frame.
That's fair reasoning. I can't complain with you on any of those things. That's a pretty base take there. But I'm going to disagree, as I am prone to do. I'm just going to say that even Tivit runs Dark Ritual. Like, we are a format that is so fast that if you aren't running fast mana, in my opinion, you're kind of stupid. You've got to run some kind of cheats in some way, shape, or form. It doesn't have to be anything crazy. You don't got to run all your stuff. But come on. Fast mana is just so good. I can't leave home without it. So I will be wedding fast mana. Now, here's where things are going to get a little bit funky for me. Because
Kinky
you would
even?
instant... What?
Kinky even?
Nope. We're cutting that out. Because you would think that I'm the turbo guy. I'm not going to... Why would I play these stacks pieces? Why would I play these hate bearers? But I'm just saying, Dothy, that's a really good card. Granite Magistrate, it's a really good card. Opposition Agent, those are a whole lot of really good cards. And yeah, you're not gonna be like, oh, I don't want the one card win con, but I don't think you need the one card win con. And I will happily put those cards in. Obviously, if you're playing Tivit, don't cut Time Sieve. Horrible idea. But I don't need to play Tivit. I can play other mid-range decks. And I want to play good creatures in those mid-range decks. And those stacks pieces happen to be really good creatures. So I will be betting stacks and killing the one card win con.
I'll take it because you deaded stacks the last time we did one of these. I'll take a promotion to bed.
I can bed little bits of stacks. The whole stacks deck, that's too much for me. All right, Neko.
So, picture this. You're getting ready for a night out on the town. You get all dolled up. Take care of yourself, make yourself look pretty. You're ready to go, only to realize you have nowhere to go. And that just kind of sucks. And that's fast mana, right? Fast mana where nowhere to take it kind of sucks. You can keep a hand with Soul Ring, Mana Crypt, but where are you going after that? Like, come on, a little bit of planning. And the worst part about it is, especially for new players coming into the format, that can be deceptive. Seeing a fast hand with no real follow-up looks really good if you're not well versed in what you're trying to do in the deck. So it's kind of a trap.
But what if I just want to look pretty, Neko?
Yeah, you can look pretty, but you're just gonna be sat there while the people are making plays and you're on your phone. So
yeah, better be slow and have a game plan than go nowhere fast.
Mm-hmm.
Fair.
So, one cards. One cards are really good, right? You get them, you win the game, it's over. And sometimes you just want to bet something, have a little fun, have it be over, move on with your night, go on to something else. In between bars, you're all gussied up now. You meet someone in the alley, It's a fling. You go on to your next. You go on to your next adventure, and one card win cons can be tricky, right? Because you may want to hook up with them, you may want to bed them, but then it's a commitment, right? You build a whole deck around them, and then you just spend the whole game trying to chase them. You tutor for them, and they're never there when you want them. And do you really want that? So, Hate Bears. Hate Bears are good cards. Hate Bears can control the format in a lot of ways. And the best part is, you get to torture your opponents with them. So, don't you want to be in a relationship with someone that you can cause misery for others and just enjoy that together? You know, a little bit of sadism. Make it fun. So, I think I will have to wed the Hate Bears.
Neko, your decision making always intrigues me and entertains.
The reason we save them for last.
So, Wed Hate Bearers.
Wed Hate Bears.
You're wedding Hate Bearers, betting 1 card win con and then killing fast mana?
Yes.
Yeah, fair enough. We've got some variation here, which makes sense. Mid-range is a complex topic, as we have learned through today.
Mm-hmm.
But I hope that all of you viewers enjoyed it. I hope that our fighting has not driven you off. And I hope you come back next time. Thank you all so much for watching. And a special thank you to our patrons. We really couldn't do this without you guys. And we will see you all next time.
See ya.